Chicago O'Hare Airport glowed under the cold white light of a fading afternoon, the loudspeaker echoing through the rush of hurried travelers. Henry Watson stood quietly near the gate, his trembling hands clutching a bouquet of red carnations. A gift he'd prepared for his daughter Emily, who was returning after 5 long years apart. He wore an old grey suit, pressed smooth despite its age, his cloudy eyes flickering with hope. But in that moment, everything shattered like glass hitting the floor. Emily approached, her high heels clicking with a chilling rhythm, her gaze devoid of warmth. "Dad," she said, her voice sharp as a blade, "I can't take you to Los Angeles. I got a promotion in New York, a big opportunity. You'll manage on your own, right?" Henry froze, the flowers quivering in his grip. "Emily, I sold the house. I have nothing left but you," he whispered, his voice breaking with pain. Emily turned away without hesitation. "I'll send money, don't worry," she said, then vanished into the crowd. Henry stood alone amidst the sea of people, his heart in pieces. Hey everyone, this is the start of Henry's story, a journey from despair to hope. If you want to find out how he overcomes this, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. What do you think Henry will do next? Engage with us, and let's explore this together. The sunlight faded beyond the terminal windows, autumn wind sweeping golden leaves past, as if carrying away the last warmth in Henry's heart. At 75, his silver hair was a tangled mess under the neon lights, his wrinkled face etched with years of sacrifice. He'd been standing there for nearly 3 hours, legs numb but refusing to sit, terrified he'd missed the moment Emily appeared. Tucked in his breast pocket was a small wooden box holding a silver ring, his late wife Eleanor's, a gift he'd saved for Emily as a symbol of family love. For so long he'd dreamed of this day, living with his daughter and grandson Oliver in California, sharing stories of gentle Eleanor, who once grew red carnations in their backyard. Henry had given everything for Emily. When she set her sights on a prestigious college in Los Angeles, he sold their memory-filled home, the place where Eleanor sang lullabies to her every night. He worked 2 jobs, driving a truck by day, mopping office floors by night, so Emily wouldn't worry about tuition. His dream of traveling Europe with Eleanor, seeing the Eiffel Tower or the Seine, faded forever. As long as she's happy, he'd told himself, straightening his tie, forcing his aching back to stand tall. The final flight from Los Angeles landed, the announcement crackling over the speakers, and Henry's heart pounded like a young man meeting his first love. People flooded out of the gate and Henry strained to spot her. Then he saw her. Emily, so different from the simple girl he remembered. Her long brown hair now shimmered blonde, a sleek black suit hugged her frame, and she pulled a designer suitcase. She walked briskly, barking into her phone. "I'll be there on time, don't worry." Henry didn't notice the coldness. He waved, shouting, "Emily, it's Dad!" His voice broke with emotion, his eyes shining like he'd found a star in the darkest night. Emily stopped, glancing up at her father, but her eyes held none of the joy Henry longed for. Just a fleeting look, like he was a stranger on the street. She hung up and stepped closer, her tone flat. "Hey, Dad." Henry threw his arms around her, holding tight as if she might vanish. "Sweetheart, I've missed you so much." "Where's Oliver? Is he okay?" His questions tumbled out, joy spilling over. But Emily gently pushed him away, stepping back. "Dad, we need to talk," she said, her gaze sliding elsewhere. A chill shot down Henry's spine, his smile faltering. "What's wrong, honey?" he asked, voice trembling. Emily sighed, glancing around like she wanted an escape. "I can't take you to Los Angeles," she said, her words clipped but icy. "I got promoted. I'm heading to New York next week. It's a huge chance, Dad." Henry shook his head, clinging to a thread of hope. "But what about me? I sold the house. I have nowhere." His voice faded, soft as the autumn breeze outside. Emily crossed her arms, impatience flashing. "You'll figure it out. A nursing home's fine. I'll send money." "You get it, right?" Henry stood still, the carnations shaking violently in his hands. He stared at his daughter, the one he'd sacrificed his life to love, now turning her back without a hint of regret. "Go," he whispered, choking on the words. "I don't want to burden you." Emily nodded, pulling her suitcase away, her figure swallowed by the crowd. The click of her heels hammered into his heart, each step slicing deeper. Henry didn't move. The airport lights cast shadows on his face, highlighting silent tears streaming down his cheeks. The crowd bumped into him, noise buzzing in his ears, but all he heard was his heart breaking. His hands tightened around the bouquet, a few red petals falling to the floor, crushed under careless feet. The wooden box slipped from his pocket, tumbling into the chaos. The silver ring sprang free, glinting under the lights, before rolling out of reach. A little girl in a yellow sweater darted over, scooping up the ring. "Mister, you dropped this," she called, her voice clear as a bell. Henry looked up, eyes blurred with tears. She placed the ring in his hand, flashing a bright smile before running back to her mom. Henry gripped it, the cold metal biting into his palm. He stumbled to a nearby bench, collapsing as the flowers slipped from his grasp, lying still on the floor. From his pocket, he pulled an old rosary, Eleanor's final gift, and began to pray. "Eleanor, what do I do now?" he murmured, lost in the noise. Night fell, the neon glow casting a cold sheen over Henry's solitary figure. He looked around at families reuniting, friends laughing in warm embraces, and realized he had no one left. The ring in his hand flickered faintly, like a dying flame. But deep inside, a tiny spark of resolve flickered to life. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew he had to keep going. For Eleanor, for himself. Night draped over Chicago O'Hare Airport. The harsh white neon lights spilling into every corner, turning the place into a soulless maze. Henry Watson, the 75-year-old man abandoned by his daughter Emily, sat motionless on a rigid metal bench, his vacant eyes watching the crowd thin out. The crumpled bouquet of white daisies lay silently by his feet, a few petals torn free by the wind, scattering like the fragments of his broken heart. Eleanor's silver ring, his late wife's, rested cold and heavy in his palm, a stark reminder of all he'd lost. Somewhere in the distance, the loudspeaker crackled, announcing the day's final flight. But Henry had no reason to care, no ticket, no home, nowhere to go. The bustle faded, leaving him with the hum of the air conditioning and the lonely echo of late travelers' footsteps. He stood, his legs aching after hours of waiting, and grabbed his tiny suitcase, all that remained of his life. He wandered through the endless corridors, his cloudy eyes searching for a quiet corner to rest. The airport, once a symbol of new beginnings, now felt like a prison with no exit. He found a small nook near the public restrooms, set his suitcase down as a makeshift pillow, and curled up on the frigid marble floor. Sleep didn't come easy. The rumble of luggage carts, the whine of overhead fans, and the bone-chilling cold kept him tossing. Just as his eyes fluttered shut, a stern voice jolted him awake. "Hey, you can't sleep here." Henry bolted upright, facing a towering security guard, his face stone-cold under the dim lights. "Sorry, I don't have anywhere to go," Henry mumbled, his voice trembling with shame and exhaustion. The guard sighed, devoid of sympathy. "This is an airport, not a shelter. You need to leave. Try the places outside." Henry nodded weakly, gathering his suitcase, though deep down he knew he had no strength left to keep moving. As the guard's shadow disappeared around the corner, Henry sank back down, clutching Eleanor's rosary, whispering a silent prayer. Morning crept in, pale sunlight filtering through the massive windows, illuminating Henry's weathered face. He shuffled outside, his feet dragging like they were bound with lead. The streets near the airport stretched out before him, cold and unfamiliar. He sought a shelter the guard had mentioned, but the worker there only shook their head. "No room, sir. Try back tomorrow." Henry pressed on, checking 2 more places, but the answer stayed the same. Exhausted and starving, he returned to the airport, the only place that still felt faintly familiar. In the public restroom, he splashed cold water on his face and stared into the mirror. The man staring back was a stranger. Tangled silver hair, sunken eyes, and hollow cheeks like a ghost of who he'd been. As Henry stepped out, a young woman in a janitor's uniform mopped the floor nearby. She looked up, her warm brown eyes meeting his lost gaze. She offered a gentle smile, a rare spark in this icy void. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft like a spring breeze. Henry hesitated, unaccustomed to sudden kindness. "Honestly." "No," he rasped, his throat rough. She paused her work, stepping closer, her name tag read Grace. "I'm Grace," she said. "If you don't mind, can I get you a coffee? You look like you could use some warmth." Henry blinked, stunned, but Grace's earnest eyes coaxed a nod from him. She led him to a hidden corner of the staff area where a small table sat beside an old coffee machine. Grace poured him a steaming cup and handed over a cheese sandwich from her own lunch bag. "Thank you, Grace," Henry said, his voice softening as the coffee's heat spread through his hands. "You're so kind." Grace smiled, sitting across from him. "It's nothing. My grandpa used to say helping others keeps your heart alive." Henry sipped the coffee, warmth soothing his parched throat. He opened up to Grace, about Emily, the house he'd sold, the abandonment that left him adrift. She listened without interrupting, her eyes dimming with sadness when he mentioned Eleanor's ring. "That ring," Grace hesitated. "It reminds me of my grandma. She had one just like it, with tiny engravings inside. She said a kind woman helped her when she was stranded at this airport decades ago." Henry froze, his hand shaking as he set the cup down. "What was her name?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Eleanor," Grace replied without missing a beat. Time seemed to stop. Henry stared at Grace, his heart pounding. Could it be? His Eleanor, the gentle soul who always lent a hand, had touched Grace's life in a way he'd never imagined. He pulled the ring from his pocket and placed it on the table. Grace leaned in, her eyes widening. "That's it," she whispered. "The same pattern." Henry said nothing, just gripped the rosary tighter, feeling like Eleanor was somehow close, guiding him through the dark. Their talk was cut short when Grace had to return to work. Before leaving, she slipped him a scrap of paper scribbled with, "You're not alone. Stay strong." Henry held it tight, a flicker of comfort piercing his storm of despair. But that warmth didn't last. That night, he found a more secluded bench to sleep on, dodging the guards' prying eyes. Just as sleep crept in, a gruff voice barked, "Hey, old man, this is my spot." Henry jolted awake, facing a hulking homeless man flanked by 2 others, their eyes glinting with menace. "Sorry, I didn't know," Henry stammered, rising to leave, but the man shoved his shoulder, nearly knocking him down. "You don't belong here. Get lost," he snarled. Henry clutched his suitcase, stumbling back, his heart racing with fear. Then a commanding voice cut through. "What's going on here?" It was James Carter, the airport security chief. Tall and imposing, with a stern face, James stepped forward, his icy gaze sweeping over the group. They shrank back, unwilling to challenge him. He turned to Henry, his tone hard. "Who are you? You can't stay here. This is an airport, not a flophouse." Henry tried to explain, voice quivering. "I've got nowhere to go. My daughter left me here." But James crossed his arms, unmoved. "I don't care about your story. No ticket, no staying. If I catch you here again, I'm calling the cops." James walked off, leaving Henry shivering and lost. He glanced at Grace's note in his hand, then up at the blinding neon lights overhead. This sprawling airport now felt like a battlefield, and he was a defeated soldier with no armor. Yet deep inside, a faint spark of resolve flared. He couldn't give up, not yet. Gripping Eleanor's ring, he whispered, "I'll find a way, my love, I promise." Morning broke over Chicago O'Hare Airport. A faint sunlight filtering through the towering glass panes, glinting off the polished marble floors. But for Henry Watson, that light couldn't pierce the icy chill in his soul. After a restless night on a secluded bench, he woke with numb legs and a heart weighed down by grief. Eleanor's silver ring, his late wife's, remained clutched in his hand, a quiet reminder that surrender wasn't an option. Grace's tiny note, "You're not alone," was tucked carefully into his jacket pocket, a fragile lifeline amid the storm of despair. Henry rose, smoothing his faded grey suit, resolve flickering in his chest. He couldn't keep drifting like a ghost through this airport forever. He shuffled to the information desk, his cloudy eyes scanning for a kind face among the bustling staff. "Hello?" he croaked, voice rough. "I need to speak to someone from management. I need help." A young employee glanced up, irritation flashing in her eyes. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. Henry shook his head, forcing a faint smile. "No, but I've got nowhere else to go. Please." She sighed, pointing down the hall. "Try the offices on the second floor. No promises, though." Henry nodded his thanks, clinging to that sliver of hope as he walked away. But before he could reach the stairs, a commotion shattered his thoughts. Near the waiting area, a group of homeless people clashed loudly with security. "We've got rights to be here," a tall man bellowed, gripping a tattered backpack. James Carter, the security chief, stood firm, his voice like steel. "This is an airport, not a shelter. Leave or I call the cops." The tension crackled like a taut string, onlookers pausing to watch, phones raised to record. Henry lingered at a distance, his heart tightening. He knew their pain, cast aside, with no one to reach out a hand. Without overthinking it, Henry stepped forward, slipping between the two sides. "Please, stop." His voice was soft but steady, cutting through the noise. Heads turned, startled by the sight of this frail old man in a worn suit. "We don't need violence," he pressed on, his gaze sweeping across their faces. "I know you're angry, but fighting won't fix anything." James frowned, skeptical. "What are you doing here again?" "I told you to leave." Henry didn't answer. Instead, he sank to his knees on the airport floor, clutching Eleanor's rosary. "Lord," he whispered, voice trembling yet clear, "grant us strength and compassion today. For those without homes, for those working hard, for those on their journeys. Help us understand each other." He looked up at James. Bless James and his team, who are just doing their jobs. Then to the group, and bless those who need a helping hand. Finally he murmured, "Eleanor, guide us." The air stilled. Shouts faded into an awed silence. A few travelers bowed their heads, joining in quiet prayer. An older man in a grey coat stepped from the crowd, his voice shaky. "Eleanor?" he echoed. He approached Henry, eyes wide. "I know that name. Eleanor Watson, right?" Henry looked up, stunned. "How do you know?" he asked, fingers still wrapped around the rosary. The man, Thomas, sat beside him, his voice low and steady. "Over 30 years ago, I was robbed in this airport. A woman named Eleanor stepped in to help me, a total stranger. She gave me money to get home, held me when I cried like a kid. She had eyes like yours. And that silver ring." He pointed to Henry's hand, where it gleamed under the lights. "I never forgot her." Trembling, Thomas pulled out his phone, recording Henry's prayer on the floor, then posted it online with the caption, "Eleanor's son is carrying on her legacy." Henry's prayer rippled outward like a wave. A young mum, clutching her child's hand, approached, eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you," she said. "Your words reminded me of my mum." A teenage boy set his phone down, silently lifting Henry's suitcase and placing it neatly beside him. James stood there, arms crossed, a flicker of confusion in his stern gaze. He didn't know what to make of this old rule-breaker who'd just done something extraordinary. Henry rose, legs shaky but eyes alight with purpose. He faced James. "I know I don't belong here," he said softly, "but I just wanted to help. If you give me a chance, I'll find a way." James stared at him for a long moment, then turned away without a word, leaving Henry amid the dispersing crowd. What Henry didn't know was that Thomas's video was exploding online, hundreds of shares, comments flooding in. Airport Angel, the man of compassion. Meanwhile, in a sleek office atop the airport, Margaret Evans, CEO of Chicago O'Hare, skimmed her packed schedule. Her phone buzzed. A young assistant had sent Thomas's video. Margaret watched it, then replayed it, her sharp eyes softening. She hit the intercom. "Cancel my morning meetings. I'm heading downstairs now." She stood, grabbing her coat, a rare determination etched on her face. The man in that video wasn't just another vagrant. He was a story begging to be heard. Back on the main floor, Henry sank onto a bench, weary but not defeated. Grace, the janitor, appeared during her break, holding a cup of hot water. "I saw what you did over there," she said, sitting beside him. "It was amazing. People are talking about you." Henry managed a faint smile. "I just did what felt right, Grace. You gave me strength yesterday. You know that?" She grinned, resting a hand on his shoulder. "I knew you were special from the start. Now the whole airport sees it too." As Grace walked off, Henry gazed out the massive windows where sunlight bathed the planes taking flight. For the first time in days, a tiny spark glowed. Chicago O'Hare Airport blazed with neon light as the day wore on. But for Henry Watson, time seemed frozen since the moment his prayer echoed through the crowd. After that heartfelt scene, Margaret Evans, the airport's CEO, had tracked him down to a small private room. She sat across from him, her sharp eyes betraying a flicker of curiosity. "I saw your video," Margaret began, her voice calm but firm. "The way you calmed that chaos was remarkable, but you have to understand, we can't let people live in the airport. It's policy." Henry nodded, his hands gripping Eleanor's rosary, his late wife's, like a lifeline. "I get it, Mom," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "But I don't want to just survive. I want to help. People here, they carry sadness, fear. I can listen, comfort them. All I need is a corner to stay in, nothing more." Margaret tilted her head, considering. "You mean like an airport chaplain?" she asked, a hint of surprise in her tone. Henry offered a faint smile. "You could call it that. I just want a chance, if you'll let me." Margaret paused, then nodded. "All right, Mr. Watson, 1-month trial basis. But the board won't like this." Word spread fast through the airport. Henry was allowed to stay, unofficially, as a quiet comforter with no title. He began his days wandering the waiting areas, his gentle eyes seeking out faces in need. One morning, he found Lily, a young woman curled up in a corner seat, her eyes red and puffy as she stared at a plane ticket. "You okay?" Henry asked, easing down beside her. Lily looked up, voice trembling. I was going to run away. My family's forcing me to marry someone I don't love." Henry listened, no judgment, just a soft hand on her shoulder. "You've got the right to choose your life," he said. "Just make sure it's what you truly want." Lily poured out her heart, tears streaking her cheeks. As she stood to leave, she unclasped a silver necklace engraved with hope and pressed it into Henry's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave me the courage to keep going." Henry held the necklace, warmth blooming in his chest, but the moment didn't last. James Carter, the security chief, loomed in the distance, his cold gaze slicing through. He marched over, voice like iron. "What are you up to now?" meddling in passengers' lives. This is an airport, not a counseling office. Henry rose, still holding Lily's necklace. I was just listening, James, he replied calmly. James stepped closer, his tone sharp. You're breaking rules, old man. You've got no right. In the heat of their exchange, James's arm brushed Henry's, knocking the necklace to the floor. It rolled a few feet away. James froze, but Henry didn't flinch. He bent down, retrieved it, and met James's eyes with quiet resolve. You can kick me out, he said, but don't kick out their hope. The words hit James like an unseen blade. He turned away, silent, a flicker of unease in his stare. From then on, Henry became woven into the fabric of the airport. He soothed jittery travelers before long flights, comforted those reeling from bad news over the phone, even stitched up torn coats with a needle and thread, borrowed from Grace. One afternoon, he sat with a group from different faiths, a Muslim, a Jew, a Catholic, praying with each in their own way. We're all searching for something bigger, Henry said, his voice warm. Here, we can find it together. Grace, the janitor, often stopped by during breaks with coffee or a small pastry. You're really this place's angel, she said, eyes shining. Henry chuckled, shaking his head. No, Grace. You're the one who gave me strength first. But not everyone approved. James watched from afar, suspicion simmering. One day he reported to Margaret, We can't keep this old man here forever. It's against every rule. Margaret crossed her arms, firm. This is an exception, James. Give him a chance. As weeks passed, Henry's health faltered. Sharp chest pains struck mid-step in the corridors, forcing him to pause, clutching his ribs, gasping for air. Grace noticed during one visit with water. You're not okay, Henry, she said, voice tight with worry. See a doctor. Henry shook his head, forcing a smile. I can't stop, Grace. Too many people need me. But he hid a secret. The airport doctor had warned him about a dangerous heart condition. You need rest, the doctor had said sternly, or you won't last long. Henry nodded, but knew he couldn't quit. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Los Angeles, Emily Watson lived in a different world. Her luxurious apartment glowed with warm golden lights, but her heart was ice. Her marriage to Tom was crumbling. Brief arguments replacing dinners once filled with laughter. At her real estate firm, Emily shone, cold, efficient, profit-driven. In a meeting, she pitched a new project. This will triple our revenue, she said confidently. A colleague hesitated. But Emily, it'll displace hundreds of poor families. Emily faltered, a fleeting memory of her father surfacing. Henry had taught her compassion mattered more than money. She shoved it aside. Business is business, she snapped. We can't miss this. Her boss nodded approval. But the scornful looks from some co-workers left Emily uneasy. That night, alone in her silent apartment with an expensive glass of wine, she stared out at the glittering city. Where's Dad now? She wondered, a pang of guilt flaring, quickly drowned by another sip. The next day, bad news hit. A major client cancelled, citing disagreement with her methods. Emily reeled, feeling her throne of power wobble for the first time. Back at O'Hare, Henry pressed on with his quiet work. One evening, he met a middle-aged man sobbing in a corner, clutching his phone. My mom just passed, the man choked out. Henry sat beside him, silently taking his hand, whispering a small prayer. Eleanor, guide her to peace. The man looked up, eyes bloodshot. Thank you, I didn't know I needed that. Henry smiled, but a chest pain surged, forcing him to grip the chair to stay upright. Grace, watching from a distance, rushed over. Henry, you have to rest, she nearly shouted, frantic. Henry panted, nodding. I'll try, Grace, but I can't abandon them. He stood, eyes resolute, unaware that fate was weaving a bigger twist for him and Emily, who was facing her own emptiness in Los Angeles. Chicago O'Hare Airport buzzed with life on a bustling afternoon, the loudspeakers' hum blending with the hurried footsteps of travelers. 5 years had passed since Henry Watson was abandoned by his daughter Emily right here, and now he was an indispensable part of this place. A silent comforter, the unofficial chaplain for lost souls. But today a familiar shadow from his past stepped in, threatening to shake the fragile world he'd built. Emily Watson emerged from the arrival's gate, pulling a designer suitcase, her high heels clicking rhythmically on the marble floor. She'd just landed from Los Angeles, chasing a new job in Chicago with a heart full of cracks. Her glamorous life was a hollow shell, a broken marriage, a career teetering after ruthless choices. In her purse she carried an old letter from Henry, written when she was a child. It scrawled words reading, "You're my light, no matter how far you go." She'd found it while packing, and it stabbed at her conscience, a reminder of the father she'd left behind. She'd planned to find him, to apologize, but before she could even strategize, fate dragged her back to this airport. As she crossed the waiting area, Emily froze. An old man with a slightly hunched back sat beside a sobbing woman, his hand gently holding hers. The way he tilted his head to listen, the soft smile he offered. It was achingly familiar. Her heart pounded. "No way," she whispered, her feet halting. The man turned, his face illuminated by the neon glow. Henry, her father. Emily's breath caught, and she ducked behind a pillar, her mind reeling. What was he doing here? Why was he still at this airport after all these years? From her hiding spot, Emily watched. Henry moved through the rows of seats, shaking hands with airport staff like old friends, guiding a lost traveler, even pausing to sew a button back onto a businessman's coat. People looked at him with respect and affection, calling him Mr. Henry. Emily couldn't believe it. The father she'd abandoned had become the heart of a community she'd never known existed. She clutched his letter, guilt surging like a tidal wave. Just then, Grace, the janitor, approached Henry with a bright smile. "Henry, take a break. I brought hot tea," she said warmly. Emily caught the name Henry, and her gaze locked onto Grace. Grace spotted her, her brown eyes widening with a flash of suspicion. She leaned close to Henry, whispering something, then turned back to Emily. "I know you," Grace said, her voice hardening. "You're his daughter, aren't you? The one from the photo he always carries?" Henry pivoted, his eyes meeting Emily's. Time stopped. "Emily?" he murmured, his voice breaking, his cloudy eyes sparking with shock and pain. Emily stepped out, tears welling up. "Dad," she choked out. Grace moved forward, planting herself protectively in front of Henry. "Do you have any idea what you did to him?" she nearly shouted, eyes blazing with tears. "Grace, enough," Henry cut in, his tone soft but firm. He stepped closer, hands trembling, gazing at his daughter with a mix of love and hurt. "What are you doing here, Emily?" he asked, his voice steady yet brimming with emotion. Emily swallowed hard, clutching the letter. I have a job in Chicago, Dad. I didn't know you were still here. I thought—" She trailed off, unable to finish. Henry studied her, his eyes deep and piercing. "You thought I'd disappeared after you left me in this airport 5 years ago," he said, not accusing, just stating the raw truth. Emily bowed her head, tears splashing onto the floor. "Dad, I'm sorry. I was selfish. I was wrong." She held out the letter, hands shaking. "I found this. I wanted to find you, but I didn't expect—" Henry reached for the letter, but suddenly froze, clutching his chest. His face paled, his breathing ragged. "Henry!" Grace cried, rushing to support him. Emily panicked, lunging forward. "Dad, what's wrong?" she yelled, her voice breaking. Grace spun on her, eyes flashing with fear and fury. "His heart's weak. He won't rest because of people here, after you abandoned him." Henry gasped, grasping Emily's hand. "Don't go, this time." he whispered, his voice faint as he slumped into Grace's arms. Chaos erupted. Staff called for an ambulance. Travelers crowded around. Henry was laid on a stretcher, still conscious but fading fast. He looked at Emily, his cloudy eyes resolute. "Stay," he rasped again, then closed his eyes as the ambulance sped off. Emily stood frozen, tears streaming, watching her father vanish. Grace turned to her, voice icy. "He spent his life helping others after you left. What about you?" Emily couldn't answer, her heart strangled by guilt, but she didn't know another storm was brewing. Back in Los Angeles, her 12-year-old son, Oliver, stood at an airport ticket counter, eyes red and swollen. He'd just fought with his dad, Tom, who buried himself in work post-divorce. Oliver had found Henry's old journal in his mom's suitcase, pages filled with dreams of family reunion. "Mom can't abandon Grandpa again," he muttered, using his savings and Tom's credit card to buy a ticket to Chicago. He boarded the plane alone, determined to find his mom and the grandfather he'd never met. Meanwhile, at a hospital near O'Hare, Emily sat by Henry's bedside, gripping his hand. He stirred, his weak voice asking, "Hearts in transit. Who'll take care of them?" It was the name of the small program he'd built to help airport travelers. Emily hesitated. I will, Dad. You rest," she said, unsure if she could keep that promise. Henry gave a faint smile, his eyes flickering with hope. The airport hummed on, but now Emily felt the weight of what her father had created. She looked at his letter, rereading, "You're my light." For the first time in years, she felt the need to become that light. Not just for him, but for herself. Unbeknownst to her, Oliver was closing in, carrying a journal that would change everything. The hospital near Chicago O'Hare Airport glowed with cold white light, the steady hum of machines filling the quiet air. Henry Watson lay on the bed, his cloudy eyes half closed, his breath shallow but laced with unspoken resilience. Beside him, Emily Watson clutched her father's hand, her red-rimmed eyes brimming with regret. She'd just watched him collapse before her at the airport, moments after their stormy reunion. "Dad, you have to get better," she whispered, gripping his old letter, the words "You're my light," now a silent reproach. Henry's eyes fluttered open, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Hearts in transit. You'll take care of it," he rasped. Emily nodded, though her heart wavered, unsure if she could shoulder the legacy he'd built over 5 years. Back at the airport, Grace stood in the waiting area, her gaze fixed toward the hospital with worry. She turned to the Hearts in Transit crew, the small band of volunteers Henry had inspired. "He'll be fine," she said, forcing optimism into her voice. But her fingers tightened around the hope bracelet Lily had given Henry, a silent prayer in her grip. The airport buzzed on, oblivious to the storm brewing from afar. Thousands of miles away in Los Angeles, Oliver, Emily's 12-year-old son, stepped off a plane at O'Hare, eyes swollen and heart heavy. In his hands was Henry's weathered journal, its yellowed pages spilling dreams of family reunion found in his mom's suitcase. "Mom can't abandon Grandpa again," he muttered, clutching it like a talisman. He'd fled home after a blowout with his dad, Tom, using his savings and a swiped credit card to buy a ticket to Chicago. He didn't know what his grandfather looked like, but the journal gave him a mission: find his mum and the grandpa he'd never met. The sprawling airport loomed before Oliver, alien and intimidating. His small feet wandered the corridors, lost amid the rushing crowd. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Emily's phone rang. Tom's panicked voice crackled through. "Emily, Oliver's gone. I think he's headed to you." Her hand shook, the phone clattering to the floor. "Oliver," she breathed, her heart stalling. She turned to Henry, voice breaking. "Dad, my son. He's here alone." Though frail, Henry struggled to sit up, his eyes blazing with purpose. "We have to find him," he said, voice weak but firm. Emily's panic flared. "Dad, you can't go. You need rest." But Henry shook his head, hand pressed to his chest. "He's my grandson, Emily. I'm going." Against the doctor's orders, he slipped on his coat and rose, legs trembling but unstoppable. Emily couldn't hold him back. She followed, dread churning in her gut. At the airport, Emily rallied Grace and James Carter, the security chief. "Oliver, 12, brown hair, green jacket," she described, voice quaking. James mobilized his team instantly, while Grace rallied hearts in transit. "We've got to find that boy," she said, eyes fierce. Word spread like wildfire. Travelers and staff joined in, turning the airport into a sprawling search grid. Emily raced through the waiting areas, shouting, "Oliver, it's Mom!" But no answer came. Meanwhile, exhausted and scared, Oliver strayed into a restricted zone near the cargo bays. He slumped behind a stack of crates, clutching the journal. Then he heard a faint cry, a tiny bird, wing broken, flailing on the floor. Oliver knelt, gently scooping it up. "Don't be scared, I'll help you," he whispered, his eyes shining with compassion, a trait inherited from the grandfather he'd never known. He cradled the bird, unaware of the danger around him. At that moment, Henry arrived at the airport, panting, hand clutching his chest, but eyes locked on his goal. He led Emily, Grace, and James in the search. A guard's voice crackled over the radio. "Kid spotted in cargo, Sector 7. They bolted, Emily's heart hammering. There stood Oliver atop a teetering stack of crates, bird in hand, eyes wide with fear. "Mom!" he cried, voice trembling. "Oliver, don't move!" Emily screamed, tears spilling. The crates wobbled, ready to collapse. Henry, despite his frailty, stepped forward, his voice rising with unexpected strength. "Oliver, it's Grandpa. Everything's okay, kiddo. Trust me." Oliver looked down, unfamiliar yet calmed by that warm tone. Rescue crews arrived, but the situation was dicey. One wrong move could bring it all crashing down. Without hesitation, Henry climbed, each step slow but steady. Emily shrieked, "Dad, no, it's too dangerous." But he ignored her, eyes fixed on Oliver. "Hey, little man," he said as he neared, voice tender. "Let Grandpa give you a hug." Oliver, tears streaming, reached out. Henry pulled him close, but the crates buckled. He lost his footing, tumbling with Oliver in his arms. Emily's scream pierced the air, but James and another guard lunged, catching them just in time, hauling them to safety. As their feet hit the ground, a miracle unfolded. The bird in Oliver's hands fluttered wildly, then soared upward through a ceiling gap. Oliver looked up, grinning through tears. "It's flying!" Henry, gasping for breath, rested a hand on his shoulder. "Birds need to fly, and so do you." Emily rushed over, enveloping them both, tears mingling with shaky laughter. "I'm sorry, Oliver." "Dad, thank you," she sobbed. Suddenly, camera flashes erupted. Reporters, tipped off about the drama, swarmed in. "You're the airport chaplain, right?" one shouted. Henry, weary but smiling, replied, "Just a family finding each other." But the story didn't end there. Footage of the rescue went viral, crowning Henry the airport angel once more. Emily gazed at her father and son, realizing she'd nearly lost the most precious thing in her life. That night, in the hospital, 3 generations sat together. Oliver handed Henry the journal. "You wrote this, Grandpa?" he asked. Henry nodded, eyes gleaming. "Never thought I'd meet you like this," he said warmly. Emily clasped their hands, resolve hardening. "I won't leave anyone again." Under the dim lights, their family reunited beneath the wings of a bird set free. Chicago O'Hare Airport shimmered under neon lights, but the air carried a new warmth, a vibrancy born from Henry Watson and his Hearts in Transit program. After an emotional reunion with his daughter Emily and grandson Oliver, Henry had become a symbol of compassion, not just within the airport, but far beyond Chicago's borders. Yet today a fresh challenge loomed for him and his family, as unexpected spotlight brought both blessings and shadows they hadn't anticipated. Henry, though visibly frailer, clung to his role as the airport's chaplain. He sat on his familiar bench, Eleanor's rosary in hand, his gentle eyes watching the flow of travelers. Emily had stepped into Hearts in Transit, managing the volunteer group when her father rested. She wore a simple jacket now, a far cry from the power-suited woman of old. Oliver, the 12-year-old with tousled brown hair, darted around the airport, helping young passengers with a beaming smile. 3 generations of Watsons had found each other, and more than that, they'd found purpose. One morning, Margaret Evans, the airport's CEO, called Henry and Emily into her office. She slid her phone across the desk, the viral video of Henry rescuing Oliver from the collapsing crates glowing on the screen. "You've created something miraculous," Margaret said, her voice buzzing with excitement. "A national TV network wants to make a documentary about Hearts in Transit. They're offering to expand it to airports across the country." Henry blinked, his trembling hands tightening around the rosary. "I never thought it'd go this far," he whispered. Emily smiled, resting a hand on his shoulder. "You deserve it, Dad." But fame didn't come without a cost. As news of Hearts in Transit spread, a rival faction from Dallas's airport schemed to undermine it. They spread rumors that Henry exploited kindness for profit, firing off anonymous emails to the press and O'Hare's board. One afternoon, as Emily guided the volunteers, James Carter approached. His face grim. "Emily, trouble's brewing," he said, handing her an online article headlined, "Airport Chaplain, Angel or Con Artist." Emily paled, her hands shaking. "They're lying. My dad would never do that." At the same moment, Henry was comforting a traveler when Grace rushed over, eyes brimming with tears. "Henry, have you seen this?" She thrust her phone at him, the article glaring back. Henry went still, a chest pang forcing him to grip the chair. "Who'd do this?" he murmured, voice faltering. Grace took his hand, firm. "We'll prove them wrong. You're the best man I know." The pressure weighed on the family. Oliver, hearing the rumors from school friends online, ran to hug his grandpa. "You're not bad, right?" he asked, eyes welling. Henry ruffled his hair, smiling faintly. "No, Oliver, I just want to help people." Emily resolved to fight back. She organized a press conference at the airport, inviting reporters and travelers alike. Standing in the waiting area, mic in hand, her voice trembled but rang strong. "My father, Henry Watson, turned this place into a home for the lost. Anyone who says he's exploiting kindness, look at what he's done." She recounted Lily's story, saved from an arranged marriage, and the bird Oliver set free. A symbol of the freedom their family reclaimed. But mid-speech, a middle-aged man stepped from the crowd, voice sharp. "How do we trust you? He was homeless, now he's famous. Who knows what he's after?" Tension crackled. Emily opened her mouth to retort, but Henry, despite his weakness, stepped forward. He held up Eleanor's silver ring, high for all to see. "I've got nothing but love for this place," he said, his voice carrying despite labored breaths. "If you don't believe me, take it all away. I don't need fame, just warm hearts." His sincerity silenced the room. An older woman approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I believe you," she said, eyes teary. Applause erupted, rippling through the airport, dissolving the rumors like mist. In the aftermath, Hearts in Transit gained official recognition. Margaret hosted a ceremony honoring Henry, transforming the waiting area into a vibrant space with flowers and banners. Hundreds gathered, travelers, staff, to thank him. Margaret took the stage. "Henry Watson showed us the power of compassion. We're exploring a nationwide expansion of Hearts in Transit, and Henry, we want you to lead it." The crowd cheered, but Henry hesitated, glancing at Emily. "I'm not sure my health's up for it," he whispered to her later. Emily squeezed his hand. "I'll help you, like you helped me." In the days that followed, the program soared. Oliver pitched a kids' corner at the airport, a spot for little ones to play and unwind during layovers. "Travel can be scary for kids," he told Henry and Emily, eyes gleaming. It was a smash hit, drawing global media attention. Grace, thanks to Henry's recommendation, was promoted to service manager, hugging him tight. "This is all because of you." But the brighter the light, the deeper the shadows. One evening, Henry sat on his favorite bench, clutching his chest, breath shorter than usual. Emily noticed his decline, though he hid it well. "Dad, we should see the doctor again," she urged, worried. Henry shook his head, smiling. "I'm living my dream, Emily. Don't fret." Unbeknownst to her, a new idea was budding in his mind. A book about hearts in transit, chronicling his journey from abandonment to reunion. Meanwhile, Margaret dropped a bombshell on Emily. "I'm retiring soon, Emily. Would you take my place?" Emily froze. Once a cold careerist in Los Angeles, she now faced the chance to lead the airport her father had made a beacon of kindness. She looked at Henry and Oliver, torn. "I need time, Dad," she said, hugging him. Henry nodded, pride shining in his eyes. "You've changed, Emily. Because of you, I know my sacrifices weren't for nothing." That night, as Oliver slept, Henry and Emily sat by their temporary hotel window, gazing at the airport lights. "I never imagined my life like this," Henry said, voice rich and warm. Emily nodded, tears tracing her cheeks. "Me neither, Dad, but I'm glad we're here together." Henry held her hand, eyes distant. "If I lead the expansion, I'll have to travel a lot. But with you here, I know it'll be okay." Beneath the airport's glow, Hearts in Transit kept spreading, not just in Chicago, but across the nation. Henry, Emily, and Oliver, 3 generations of a once shattered family, now lit the way for lost hearts, proving that from ashes, hope could still soar. Chicago O'Hare Airport glowed under the sunset, the day's last rays streaming through the massive windows, casting a golden hue over the cold marble floor. Henry Watson sat on his beloved bench, clutching Eleanor's rosary, his cloudy eyes tracing the ebb and flow of travelers. After years of abandonment, he'd turned this place into a sanctuary of compassion through Hearts in Transit. Beside him stood Emily Watson and Oliver, his daughter and grandson, now torchbearers of his legacy. But today, one chapter was closing, paving the way for an eternal one. Hearts in Transit had outgrown Chicago. Following Henry's honoring ceremony, the program spread to dozens of airports nationwide, guided by Emily and bolstered by Margaret Evans, the soon-to-retire CEO. Henry, though his health waned, remained its soul, inspiring with every story he shared. One evening, he surprised his family. "I want to write a book about our journey so it lives forever." Emily, stunned, hugged him tight. "That's brilliant, Dad. I'll help you." Oliver, beaming, chimed in, "I want to write the kids' corner part." The book, Hearts in Transit, A Journey of Faith and Redemption, took shape over months of tireless work. Henry sat on his bench, penning lines by hand, pausing when chest pains forced him to rest. When it hit shelves, it soared to bestseller status, touching millions. One afternoon at the airport, a young woman approached Henry, tears in her eyes. "Your book saved me," she said, voice trembling. "I was ready to give up. But your words gave me hope." Henry took her hand, smiling faintly. "You're not alone," he whispered, echoing the note Grace once wrote him. But time couldn't be defied. One morning, Henry collapsed on his bench, hand pressed to his chest. Emily and Oliver rushed him to the hospital, where the doctor shook his head gravely. "His heart's too weak. We've done all we can." Henry awoke, gazing at his daughter and grandson, voice faint. "Don't be sad. I've lived fully." He reached into his pocket, pulling out Eleanor's silver ring and a folded letter. "Emily, this is for you," he said. "I wrote it in Athens, when we went to Europe. If I can't go on, keep this flame alive." Emily unfolded the letter, tears spilling as she read his final words. "You're my light, like I wrote when you were little. Never forget that. Let hearts in transit soar, like the bird Oliver freed that day." Henry smiled one last time, gripping their hands, then closed his eyes. He slipped away peacefully under the hospital lights, leaving a void nothing could fill. Henry's funeral unfolded at the airport, the place where he'd been abandoned and later made his home. Hundreds gathered around his bench, travelers, staff, volunteers, now adorned with a small plaque, "Henry's Hope." Emily stood there, holding her father's ring, voice breaking. "My dad taught me it's never too late to start over. He was our flame, and now we must keep it burning." Oliver laid a bouquet of white daisies, Eleanor's favorite, on the bench, whispering, "I'll make you proud, Grandpa." After Henry's passing, Hearts in Transit didn't falter. Emily, with Grace and James Carter by her side, expanded it to hospitals, train stations, and public spaces. Oliver, now 13, led a junior volunteer crew, turning the Kids' Corner into a model replicated nationwide. One day, Tom, Oliver's dad, visited Chicago. Seeing his son thriving with Emily and the program, he relinquished their custody battle. "He belongs here," Tom said, eyes tinged with sorrow. "I've never seen him shine like this." One afternoon, James stopped by Emily's office, once Margaret's, now hers, after taking the helm. "Henry changed me," he said, voice low. "From a rigid rule follower, I learned to believe in kindness. Thank you for carrying on his dream." Emily smiled, gazing out at the airport. "No, James, thank you for being here from the start." At sunset, Emily and Oliver stood by Henry's Hope. Travelers left notes on the bench, prayers, thanks, a living memorial. "Dad was right," Emily murmured. "Life's a maze of paths, but it's where we end up that matters." Oliver hugged her, adding, "And family's the people we choose to love." As the sun dipped, its golden light bathed the airport, once the start of Henry's pain, now the heart of a compassion revolution. Henry Watson, from a forsaken soul, left a timeless legacy, not just through Hearts in Transit, but in the hearts he touched. Emily looked skyward, imagining that free bird soaring past, and smiled. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered, knowing Henry's flame would burn forever. Hey everyone, that's a wrap on Henry Watson's journey in Hearts in Transit, ending under the glowing sunset at Chicago O'Hare Airport. From a man abandoned by his daughter Emily, Henry turned his pain into a flame that warmed millions of hearts, leaving behind a legacy that lives on through the Henry's Hope bench and his inspiring book. Emily and Oliver are carrying the torch now, but is this really the end of the story? What do you think about their journey? If Henry was still here, what would he do next to spread compassion? And which moment from these 8 chapters hit you the hardest? The bird taking flight, the prayer in the middle of the airport, or Henry's final letter? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this story, smash that like button and hit subscribe so you don't miss out on more emotional journeys coming your way. We can't wait to hear your ideas. They might just shape the next chapters we create together. Thanks so much for being part of this ride.